The Wizard of Oz is undoubtedly one of the most beloved American films of all time. In fact, it's so beloved that it's almost exhausting. One of those properties that's become more of a brand than anything else. Spin-offs, merch, parodies, you name it. Sometimes, when something is that omnipresent, its popularity can affect the way that you think about it. Either you overlook it, or maybe even start to consider it overrated. I have to admit that I've fallen into that trap, dismissing The Wizard of Oz with an eye roll. Sure, it's great. Everyone knows that. Let's move on. At least until recently. Revisiting this film not long ago, I now appreciate it for different reasons than I did as a child, less for its enchanting entertainment value, and more as a masterwork of filmed narrative storytelling. At just under 2 hours, it is one of the tightest and most efficient films I have ever seen. Each character's goals are quickly defined, the lessons are clear, each arc is neatly resolved. It uses the dream sequence trope in a fair way. The tenor of each performance is in sync, it's visually cohesive, the pacing is excellent. This cohesive becomes particularly shocking when you consider The Wizard of Oz's production history, which was the opposite of cohesive, to say the least. About 12 screenwriters worked on its screenplay, and 4 different directors led its production. Nowadays, those numbers would immediately send up a red flag. That's far too many cooks in the kitchen. It would signal that something was amiss, that the studio was scrambling for anyone to come in and clean up the mess. And what a mess it was. Like, if MGM had a human resources department, they would have been working overtime to deal with what happened on this set. Injuries, abuse, hospitalization. Not good. These stories have been well covered elsewhere, and I highly recommend you check them out. But despite all the turmoil behind the scenes, we know a lot of things had to go right for this film to turn out the way it did. And that's what I want to focus on today. The happy accidents, the way studio politics, economics, and individual skill sets fortuitously came together to finish the puzzle that was The Wizard of Oz. This video isn't intended to distract or minimize those more scandalous aspects, but rather to add to and offer an understanding of how filmmaking worked at a major studio in the 1930s. We could tell this story any number of ways. The last-minute hoops Judy Garland had to jump through to prove she was the proper choice to play Dorothy, the innumerable drafts by screenwriters who took the story in strange directions. But I specifically want to look at the 4 directors who worked on Oz: Richard Thorpe, George Cukor, Victor Fleming, and King Vidor. Why couldn't one director complete this film? Why were they picked? What did they offer as artists and leaders? How did their individual visions affect the final film? And what does Gone with the Wind have to do with all of this? Hopefully by the end of this video, we'll understand how on earth too many cooks ended up making such a delicious feast. Before we get started, I want to thank the sponsor of this video, Mubi, a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema. Click on the link in the description of this video to try Mubi free for 30 days. Go to mubi.com/BeKindRewind to watch some excellent titles, including Park Chan-wook's Decision to Leave, for free right now. So one of the first things we need to know is what the expectations were for the director of The Wizard of Oz. There are 2 things I want to note here. One, The Wizard of Oz was intended to be a prestige film. In 1937, Disney released Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Not only was this film extraordinarily successful at the box office, but it was also a smash hit with critics and was considered a genuine work of art. Walt Disney received an honorary Academy Award with 7 little statues attached for each of the dwarves for the film's significant screen innovation, which charmed millions and pioneered a great new entertainment field. With Oz, MGM meant to replicate Disney's success, appealing to both children and adults by leaning into the fantastical. To accomplish this, they set aside a lot of time and money to ensure the film's success. To them, it would be worth it. Oz might not turn a profit, but they hoped it would further bolster the reputation of the studio and rank it as an industry innovator. 2. The Wizard of Oz is a weird movie. Because we watch Oz so often now, and because movies that are spiritually akin to Oz are made every 2 minutes, we tend to lose sight of it in its own context as a film of the late 1930s. Especially when compared to its fellow Best Picture nominees, which were largely historical dramas and adaptations of classic literature, Oz is a very strange film. So on the one hand, you have Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Wuthering Heights, and on the other, you have a Technicolor action-adventure musical with battles, special effects, and a cast that included a talking lion, witches, and flying monkeys. Even as a musical, it was somewhat unconventional in its time. Musicals then were often set backstage at a theater or around show business in some capacity, giving the actors an excuse to perform intricate numbers throughout the film on a stage, not in quote-unquote real life. And only on rare occasions, like 1932's Love Me Tonight, did any of the songs in these musicals actually relate to the plot at hand like they do in Oz. What's more, during the songs, the film largely eschews memorable or involved choreography. There's no Busby Berkeley-esque kaleidoscopic chorus, nor anything remotely akin to what Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers were doing, which by that point had definitively dominated the box office. All of this is to say that whoever took the reins of Oz would have to be capable enough to cobble together a prestige picture, but also extraordinarily flexible, open-minded, and imaginative to blend these genres together in a way that few filmmakers had ever done before. So why on earth did they pick Algene Harmetz notes in her seminal text, The Making of the Wizard of Oz, that producer Mervyn LeRoy could not remember why he selected Richard Thorpe to direct Oz, nor was Thorpe ever sure why he was chosen. We already know he was fired, so clearly he wasn't the right choice in retrospect, but digging into Thorpe's filmography, I think we can make a pretty educated guess as to where LeRoy was coming from when he made that initial decision. Having worked with the studio for many years, by 1938, MGM frequently trusted Thorpe with important but routine material. He directed some Myrna Loy, William Powell vehicles at a time when the studio was very invested in exploiting the popularity of that pair. He had directed Louise Reiner in The Toy Wife when they were most heavily devoted to making her the next big thing. He had also directed a few of the Tarzan sequels, which were huge moneymakers for MGM. So theoretically, we have the makings of a good fit for The Wizard of Oz. He could work well with up-and-coming stars, which is what Judy Garland would have been considered at that time. He could film action sequences in fantastical situations, and could deliver lighthearted, humorous material. Thorpe could also serve MGM's bottom line. Described by TCM as proficient to the point of boredom, he was famously committed to efficiency. He would finish films ahead of schedule, often by only doing one take of each shot, doing another only if an actor messed up. He also rarely insisted on editorial changes that would put his artistic stamp on a film. These qualities seem preposterous and borderline irresponsible by modern standards, but in the context of the studio system, this attribute was actually quite valuable. In the studio system, and especially at MGM, producers were thought of as more important to a project than a director, and the studio was most important of all. Directors had less authorial control over their films than we tend to think of today, often being assigned to projects after actors had been cast, scripts written, sets designed, etc. Generally speaking, films had to adhere to a studio's house style, which producers determined. In that way, directors were sometimes thought of as interchangeable, traffic cops you could plug into any project and do the producer's bidding. There are, of course, exceptions to this, and it varies from studio to studio, but Thorpe is a great example of this kind of reliable company guy who was mainly there to execute the producer's vision. In this case, many creative decisions had already been shepherded and approved by producers Mervyn LeRoy and Arthur Freed, so hiring Thorpe wouldn't have seemed like too much of a risk. Indeed, Thomas Schatz writes in The Genius of the System that the selection of second-rate staffer Richard Thorpe, Harsh, indicated that Louis B. Mayer was satisfied with the preparation of the picture and that he assumed LeRoy, who had been a top director at Warner's, would be acting as a virtual producer-director. While this kind of director could be a blessing to the studio, it wouldn't work for every project, especially big, expensive prestige projects that involved several technical innovations. This was immediately evident to Leroy when he reviewed Thorpe's work. According to Harmetz, Thorpe's 2 weeks had been spent shooting scenes in the Witch's Castle with Dorothy, the Tin Woodman, the Scarecrow, and the Cowardly Lion. He also shot immense amounts of films of Toto escaping from the castle and returning to help rescue Dorothy. Leroy hated all of it. It was missing something, a creative flair. He was a wonderful guy, Dick Thorpe, Leroy told Harmetz. He made some fine pictures, but to make a fairy story is a different kind of thing entirely. He didn't quite understand the story. He just didn't have the warmth or the feeling. To make a fairy story, you have to think like a kid. You'll be hard-pressed to find anything Thorpe filmed for The Wizard of Oz in the film because, well, it was scrapped. Thorpe was dismissed, and after 2 weeks of filming, they had to start again at square one. George Cukor, by his own admission, was not the person to bring in if you were looking for someone who could evoke the whimsy and imagination of a child. But as a team player, like every MGM director, he agreed to serve as a temporary placeholder to get things in order before the next director could come on board. And by temporary, I mean very temporary, like 3 days. So while Cukor spent very little time on the production, he had the chance to review Thorpe's work, agree it wasn't working, and make a few minor but significant changes. To understand what Cukor might have been looking for, and the adjustments he might be inclined to make during this short tenure, we have to know a little bit about his prior work. Cukor was, by this point, a prominent director, working on melodramas, refined literary adaptations, and sophisticated comedies like Dinner at 8, Little Women, and Romeo and Juliet. While Cukor is less known for specific filmic visual techniques, he is, and was, understood to be an excellent director of actors, or more specifically, of actresses. By directing Katharine Hepburn in her star-making debut, A Bill of Divorcement, Greta Garbo in perhaps her greatest sound performance in Camille, and later Ingrid Bergman in Gaslight, Audrey Hepburn in My Fair Lady, and on and on and on, he earned a reputation as a woman's director. He despised this label, partly because it erases the fact that he also directed several Best Actor winning performances, and probably because, for a long time, making women's pictures relegated you to the trash bin of film history. Sure enough, for many years, his reputation took a measurable hit because of this label. For Cukor, the key to getting a film right was in the details of a performance. He told Film Comment in 1972, "I achieve practically all my film effects through actors and actresses. Other directors get their effects by photographing a turned doorknob, etc. I like to concentrate on actors' faces." Because he began his career in film as a director of dialogue, he also developed a notoriously good ear for how an actor speaks. To him, a good performance could locate authenticity even in the most fictitious of circumstances.
You have to dig out what is real and valid. Let's say Camille. There were things in that were conventions, that a bad woman would ruin a young man's life. But if you do it so that everybody understands it, and you dig out the reality and the truth of it, because the truth will move people.
So given all this, it's no surprise that the most iconic changes Cukor implemented on Oz had to do with Judy Garland's performance. Upon review of Thorpe's footage, Gerald Clark writes in his biography of Garland, Get Happy, Cukor instantly saw where Thorpe had gone wrong. His Oz was not believable. He'd invested so much effort in making Judy look pretty, for example, that she looked not like a simple farm girl from Kansas, but like a Hollywood starlet masquerading as a simple farm girl, with heavy makeup and long blonde hair. Even her acting seemed artificial to Cukor, as if she had been instructed to be cute, to act, as he described it, in a fairy tale way. Cukor felt that Dorothy needed to be transparently sincere. If Dorothy unhesitatingly accepted the wacky characters of Oz, so would the audience, and the easier it would be to find the human truth in an otherwise outlandish tale. Cukor stripped Dorothy of her glamorous makeup in favor of a more natural look, and replaced her long blonde wig with pigtails in a reddish-brown hue, closer to Garland's actual hair color. I think it's safe to say that Cukor was right here. Maybe it's a familiarity bias, but there's something not right about this wig. It's a lot. A hairstyle a young girl could feasibly do on her own, paired with light pink lips, relatively subdued fake lashes, and little else but blush, works much better. It's still very polished and manicured, but this is MGM in the 1930s we're talking about. We're not going to get Judy Garland costumed like a Dorothea Lange portrait. In addition to altering her look, Cukor also directed new tests with Judy Garland and instructed her to not act in a fancy schmancy way. She must always remember, he said, that she was just a little girl from Kansas. Obviously, Cukor never filmed Garland for the final film, and we can't really know the extent to which his involvement affected her performance, so I don't want to overemphasize his contribution or minimize Garland's skill. But it's hard not to imagine, given the stack of great performances Cukor left in his wake, that a few days with Garland could be enormously helpful, particularly at this juncture in her career, where she was relatively green and until then had received little useful direction for this role. He, of course, also later guided Garland through what I consider her best performance in A Star is Born. Watching the film now, one senses that Cukor's instinct was correct. Dorothy's sincerity and openness to her unconventional companions makes her so endearing. She never smirks or condescends them, she empathizes and seeks to help them, and doesn't look too wide-eyed or airy in the way that Disney princesses from this era do, for example. Cukor was never meant to stay on Oz long term, and after a few days happily moved on to a project that was much more up his alley, Gone with the Wind, leaving Leroy on the hunt for another new director, someone who would hopefully see the project through to the end, someone with the mind of a child who could really understand what made the story work. Who he picked wasn't exactly the first person who might have come to mind for that criteria. Victor Fleming, like Richard Thorpe, was a versatile team player who would have been used to stepping into ongoing projects or doing uncredited work in the interest of the studio. His filmmaking had a much more consistent personality than Thorpe's, though. A big game-hunting, motorcycle-riding womanizer outside of work, Fleming became known for portrayals of masculinity and humor. He frequently directed actors like Clark Gable and Gary Cooper in westerns and more mature comedies like Red Dust. Speaking of Red Dust, he also directed some of Jean Harlow's best work in Reckless and Bombshell. Two films, though, that likely convinced Leroy that Fleming would be a good candidate for Oz were Treasure Island and Captain's Courageous. These films share several important characteristics with Oz. Both are adaptations of beloved books, both have well-orchestrated action sequences, and both are told from the perspective of a child. The boys in these films enter a world unknown to them through chance interactions with strangers. They learn the rules of the road, grow to love the eccentric characters they meet along the way, and ultimately mature because of their experiences. Relevant to the tone Leroy wanted for Oz is that while these films take a child's point of view, they aren't childish. They convey the naivete and innocence of youth while taking seriously the things they experience as an adult story. On a more granular level, both films clearly display the technical prowess and creativity Thorpe ostensibly lacked. Captain's Courageous takes place primarily on a ship, which could feel cramped or limiting, but never does, thanks to Fleming's clever use of angles. In Treasure Island, he uses the camera to put the audience in Jim's shoes. This shot, where we first meet Long John Silver, is my favorite, using his perspective to peer through the ship and up at the pirate. Or this one, where he's staring upward as if in awe of the mechanics of sailing and the dexterity of the sailors. In his talk at the Library of Congress, Fleming biographer Michael Sragow cites two of his early films that further elaborate on his technical ability and artistic sensibility. First, When the Clouds Roll By from 1919, one of Fleming's many collaborations with Douglas Fairbanks. Here, in a sequence that highlights the actor's athleticism, we see Fairbanks eat a meal, fall asleep, and begin dreaming. The food he ate transforms into characters who chase him through the grounds of his home, as Fairbanks leaps through the air and flips over a fence to evade them. He eventually runs back inside, where he walks on the ceiling out of reach of the helpless food below. It's silly, but Fleming clearly shows comfort with technical innovations, using high-speed filming to capture slow motion, and rotating a room to create an optical illusion. He also shows his sense of the pacing of comedy, contrasting the graceful athleticism of Fairbanks with the fumbling ineptitude of the food. It's a brand of humor Fleming employed again and again, sometimes in ways that are wildly prescient. Take Mama's Affair from 1921, where Fleming got ahead of the talking tree gag by over a decade. As Sragow puts it,
you see an incredible confidence of a director who will just take outrageous material and go with it and understand the psychology of it, and understand the humor of it.
This was the imagination Leroy needed to orchestrate an army of flying monkeys, to capture the comedic gags of veteran vaudevillian actors, to devise explosions and bubbles, a melting witch and a faux wizard. Fleming wasn't necessarily interested in working on Oz, but coincidentally had just leaned into becoming more of a family man, and thought making a film that might appeal to his daughters might be nice. Another stroke of luck for MGM, Fleming brought with him his frequent collaborator, screenwriter John Lee Mahan, who reworked this Kansas portion of the screenplay and is largely responsible for the beginning of the film as we see it today. Ultimately, Fleming directed the bulk of The Wizard of Oz, everything that actually took place in Oz. They left the Kansas scenes for last, but before Fleming could touch them, he was reassigned. He wasn't pulled off of Oz because MGM was unhappy with his work. He was pulled off because his services were specifically requested elsewhere, on the set of Gone with the Wind. Now you may be wondering, wait a minute, didn't you just say that George Cukor left Oz to work on Gone with the Wind? Yes, I did, and yes, he did. Cukor had been directing Gone with the Wind for about 3 weeks, but his work wasn't satisfying the film's producer, David O. Selznick. According to The Making of Gone with the Wind by Steve Wilson, the two spent weeks jockeying over the tone of the production. Finally, when they couldn't agree on the tempo or tenor of the childbirth scene, Cukor was fired. MGM reassigned him to The Women, a comedy that essentially epitomizes his skill for honing dialogue delivery and actresses' performances. Although Gone with the Wind was not being produced by MGM, MGM had invested a great deal of money and resources into that film in return for half of the film's profits from its distribution. This included access to MGM's talent, so when the film needed a new director, Selznick once again turned to MGM. Fleming, a preferred collaborator of Clark Gable's, was brought in to complete the film. As big as MGM wanted Oz to be, Gone with the Wind had to be even bigger, so even though Fleming hadn't finished Oz, it didn't matter. Gone with the Wind was the priority. Another replacement could be arranged to bring Oz across the finish line. But who would be up to the task? That MGM could call upon King Vidor to finish up this film shows what a true embarrassment of riches the studio had in the late 1930s. One of the true masters of the silent era, Vidor had earned relative independence for a director of the 1930s. Put off by the extensive and controlling contracts of the major studios, he tended to flit from one to the other, consenting to short-term contracts only, often for a handful of films at a time. In 1939, Vidor found himself in the middle of one such contract at MGM. Once again, Vidor's involvement in Oz was intertwined with the demands of Gone with the Wind. According to Vidor, he had been asked by Selznick to read the scripts of Gone with the Wind in the hopes of hiring the director to start filming in the immediate aftermath of Cukor's dismissal. Vidor was extremely daunted by the task. "I was going to put up a big argument over doing the film so quickly," he said, "but over the weekend, without telling me, Selznick had made a deal with Mayer to get Fleming because Clark Gable had asked for Victor. So David asked me if I would take over The Wizard of Oz. I was so relieved to get out of undertaking Gone with the Wind that I said, sure, that'll be great." Worth mentioning here that according to Wilson's book, Fleming was always Selznick's first choice to replace Cukor. As one of the more independent directors with bona fide masterpieces to his name, Vidor was often given more free rein artistically, and we can point to more obvious signature trademarks of his visual style. Vidor directed his first feature film at age 24 in 1919. I mention this because Vidor consistently credited his style as a director to the demands of the silent era.
Imagery was the dominant factor, along with rhythm and pace and tempo, in my mind and in probably the mind of many other silent film directors, but certainly in mine.
So even in his sound films, Vidor learned how to orchestrate massive action sequences with almost no dialogue, employing special effects, well-timed stunts, and expert positioning of the camera. One TCM documentary about Vidor uses this great battle in Vidor's last film, Solomon and Sheba, which needs not a sentence of dialogue to convey a captivating series of events. As we know, Vidor had to complete the Kansas scenes, which were perfectly suited to this technique, most obviously with the tornado. Once again, this is essentially a silent sequence, but extraordinarily effective thanks to his expert deployment of special effects, seamlessly rear projecting footage of a miniature muslin sock to create the illusion of a distant twister ripping through the plains of Kansas. Rhythm also played a key role in Vidor's films. He developed a technique called silent music, in which he would use a metronome and a bass drum to coordinate and time the movements of the cast and create a visual sense of rhythm. To my knowledge, he didn't use this technique on Oz, but his emphasis on movement definitely came into play in one of the film's most iconic scenes, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. It's a unique number in the show in that it has little to no action attached to it. It's a pure ballad. Dorothy is very basically standing in a barnyard and singing. That's it. Under-choreograph it and you risk boring the audience, which is how most ballads were filmed at this time, stationary. Over-choreograph it and you risk pulling focus from the purpose of the song. Vidor takes a simple but effective approach here. The camera simply tracks her as she slowly moves through the yard, spending about one phrase per verse in different locations. When she finally parks in one spot toward the end of the song, the camera gently pulls back and resituates her in the frame. It's not complex, but it's effective. He's spatially aware, lightly sentimental, and frankly wise enough to let Judy Garland's performance remain the centerpiece of the scene. This is the audience's most intimate moment with Dorothy in the film, bonding us to her by giving us access to her most private desires. Because Kansas bookends the film, it was imperative that those scenes hit the correct emotional notes, set up the disillusionment and devotions that guide Dorothy's arc, then neatly bring her back down to earth, so to speak, finally reveling in relief and familiarity. It would require a deft, sensitive hand to convey what Clark calls the tender emotions of a frustrated adolescent. Fleming was less skilled with actors than Vidor. Not that he was bad, his style was just more blunt, and he usually received much more blunt performances. And despite directing Jean Harlow and Clara Bow to great success, he was not known to work well with actresses. He literally slapped Judy Garland because she was ruining takes by laughing during this scene. For what it's worth, Vivien Leigh much preferred Cukor to Fleming, and according to Harmitz, she continued to consult with him after he'd left Gone with the Wind. Cukor might have excelled here, but as we know, he was busy elsewhere, and frankly worked better with more sophisticated material. Vidor was kind of the best compromise, excellent with actors, and more specifically at tapping into the perspective of the everyman. His films often follow otherwise anonymous, regular people, thrust into situations beyond their control. They relish in small moments with big emotional impact, often involving reunions or family ties. And he gets so much out of his actors in these moments. This scene with John Gilbert as a soldier reuniting with his true love in the big parade. This scene in The Champ, in which he gets much more out of Walter Beery and Jackie Cooper in a few minutes than Victor Fleming did in the entirety of Treasure Island, in which a young boy learns he won't be living with his father anymore. And who could forget this scene in Stella Dallas, in which a mother lovingly but tragically observes her estranged daughter's wedding, one of Barbara Stanwyck's greatest performances. In other words, I cannot think of someone more suited to capture Dorothy's return from Oz, the emotional payoff of the entire film, than King Vidor. Finally, with the Kansas scenes filmed, The Wizard of Oz was ready for editing. Only time would tell if all this effort had been worth it for MGM. realize I've spent the past several minutes explaining why these directors were mostly in the right place at the right time. It's important, though, not to lose sight of the fact, though, that there was plenty of turmoil on this set and unexpected challenges that drove up the cost of the film and put it far behind schedule. Where MGM could typically crank out a small film in less than a month for less than $500,000, Oz took a little over 5 months to make and cost over $2.7 million. The film actually did do really well, though. People enjoyed it, and it earned about $3 million. But with additional advertising and distribution costs, etc., it meant that ultimately it resulted in a net loss of roughly $1 million for MGM. As popular as it was, it still didn't become the instant classic we might assume. Despite its box office success, critics were decidedly more mixed. I think in part because there was so little to compare it to. Almost all of them mentioned Snow White at some point in their reviews, most of them stating its obvious superiority. The New Yorker's Russell Maloney landed possibly the most scathing hit in his review, which read, "Fantasy is still Walt Disney's undisputed domain. Nobody else can tell a fairy tale with his clarity of imagination, his simple good taste, or his technical ingenuity." This was forcibly borne in on me as I sat cringing before MGM's Technicolor production of The Wizard of Oz, which displays no trace of imagination, good taste, or ingenuity. Frank Nugent at the New York Times gave a much more ringing endorsement. By courtesy of the Wizards of Hollywood, The Wizard of Oz reached the Capitol screen yesterday as a delightful piece of wonderworking which had the youngsters' eyes shining and brought a quietly amused gleam to the wiser ones of the oldsters. Not since Disney's Snow White has anything quite so fantastic succeeded half so well. In terms of its awards potential, as you might know, 1939 was a notoriously stacked year, dominated by the absolute juggernaut of a film, Gone with the Wind. However, Oz did win Best Original Score, Best Original Song, and a Juvenile Honorary Award for Judy Garland. Victor Fleming would win Best Director, but for Gone with the Wind. So did Oz achieve what MGM wanted it to achieve? It's debatable. It didn't necessarily garner the critical praise of Snow White, but it was clearly respected, and the financial losses might have felt like more of a punch to the stomach had Gone with the Wind not brought in hordes of cash for them that year. That The Wizard of Oz didn't become a series in the vein of Tarzan or The Thin Man, and that there aren't any famous imitations from that time period, though, kind of gives you an idea of where their minds were at. That was fun. Let's not do that again. Oz's legacy as a classic was formed much later, both by the advent of television and, once again, a coincidental connection to Gone with the Wind. In 1956, CBS tried to lease Gone with the Wind from MGM for $1 million. MGM refused. As an afterthought, CBS made a $22,500 offer for The Wizard of Oz. MGM agreed and also gave CBS an option to broadcast the film annually. With that opportunity, CBS made The Wizard of Oz an event, something for children to look forward to every year, slowly endearing the film and its characters to generation after generation. I'm almost positive the first time I saw it was on some kind of television event like that in the 90s. If you haven't seen The Wizard of Oz in a while, I suggest you give it a shot. You might find, like I did, that you notice and appreciate different things with time. Before I sign off, I want to thank Mubi for sponsoring this video. Mubi is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there's always something new to discover. Each and every film on this platform is hand-selected. It's like your own personal film festival, streaming anytime, anywhere. As you might know, last month I published my 12 Days of Actress video, which is part of an annual series I do in which I recommend 12 performances I really love. It's been incredible to hear from people who've actually sought out those films and said that they really enjoyed them. If you want to get in on the action and see what all the fuzz is about, you're in luck. A lot of the films I recommended this year are actually streaming on Mubi right now, which means all you have to do is click the link in my description and you can start watching them for free. In the meantime, I'll be participating in Sundance Fever by checking out some films I've missed on their Sundance Favorites playlist, which has a bunch of selections from festivals past. Strawberry Mansion, River of Grass, Vitalina Varela, Lilting, They seriously have so much to dive into, and if you love film, I highly recommend that you check them out. You can try Mubi free for 30 days at mubi.com/BeKindRewind. That's mubi.com/BeKindRewind for a whole month of great cinema free.